Hello, Azure Platform Engineering friends. Welcome to a new episode of the APE podcast. Today, I have with me Jack Tracey, who's going to teach us all about Azure Landing Zones. Jack, welcome on the show. Can you introduce yourself?
No, thanks for having me, Mark. And I'll happily introduce myself. So, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Jack Tracey. I'm a senior cloud solution architect here at Microsoft. I've been at Microsoft about 4.5 years. Before that, spent all of my time in the partner space and was a former Azure MVP as well. So, a big appreciation for that program as well. And I have been working in the Azure Landing Zone space pretty much my entire career inside of Azure, but it wasn't called Azure Landing Zones when I was doing it outside of Microsoft. And since coming through Microsoft, I now end up being the technical lead for Azure Landing Zones inside of Microsoft.
Cool. All right. Thank you for the introduction. So let's just dive direct into it. So what are Azure Landing Zones and why should I use them?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question, right? And the term landing zone is probably one of the most overused phrases within Microsoft. So I apologize, and we are really trying to make sure that we're conscious when we think about it. The amount of meetings that I've had, is it landing zone or landing zones with an S, is undescribable. Like, I've spent so much time in meetings about that, you would not want to believe. But what are they? So when a customer is going through their cloud adoption journey, right, you've decided you want to go into Azure and you want to get started. Obviously, the cloud adoption framework provides you a lot of guidance in terms of how to plan, how to build your teams, how to organize, and then how to get ready, right? And when you get to that ready phase of the cloud adoption framework, you'll find that's when you actually start deploying stuff into Azure. Like, that's when you start configuring your Azure landing zone to set up the rest of your organization to be able to consume Azure safely, securely, in a governed manner, at scale, right? So we're not just talking around 2 or 3 subscriptions here. You may start there, but we've got customers out there who've got hundreds of thousands of subscriptions under the management of their Azure landing zone. And really, it's all around giving the platform team or central IT teams all of the control and the security things that they want, whilst handing out subscriptions to their application teams like candy, right? Think of it as a vending machine. Like, application teams want to consume Azure, but platform teams want to make sure they do it in the right way. And that's how we build Azure Landing Zones, to basically find that balance, right? If you think of Lady Justice standing there with the scales hanging in the balance, that's a good way about thinking about Azure Landing Zones, right? We've got the platform team on one side, the application team on the other. It's finding the middle ground so that both can do what they need to do in a fast, accelerated way. And Azure Landing Zones is guidance, architecture, 8 design areas, 5 design principles, and we provide 3 implementation options, right? So there's a portal experience, there's Bicep, and there's Terraform as well. So yeah, a lot to take in, but in short, it's how you start in Azure and how you should stay right in Azure.
And about that last part, because what I read and also experience with when I'm doing Azure Landing Zones at my customers is to find the sweet spot of starting with Azure Landing Zones or just start exploring Azure. Because I see organizations where they first do everything right and they are so ahead of actually in the ready phase, and then the implementation phase start, and it's not mixing and matching up, right? So they're lagging behind. They're actually too far already. So how can Azure Landing Zones help that sweet spot? What is your advice for companies to say where you have a more like rolling approach of implementation and actually ready and make it more governance, better in governance, so to say, and then improving it. There's that balance, right? There's you can implement it all the way up, and then it's like really hard to implement and adopt with applications. And there's a way where it's like a zoo that's broken out with all the monkeys running everywhere, and it's like a mess. And then you need to implement the governance in the later phase. Like those are the 2 extremes. And how to find that balance, and when do you think, and I hope I explained that a little bit clear, but where do you think the sweet spot lies on, and how can you advise on these kind of implementation tasks?
Yeah, and I think it's a good question, right? And not only for those customers who are starting on this journey, but a lot of people aren't starting in Azure now, right? Like they've been in Azure for 5 years, 10 years, however long. And they may be looking at their current estate and going, we've got the zoo. How do we bring it back into some sort of control? And, it's organized and we can start, having governance and security policies applied and start having a well-maintained environment. So we would refer to those as brownfield customers, right? How do we help those
Yeah.
brownfield customers? We have a ton of guidance in our docs that I'm sure we can leave some links somewhere. So aka.ms/alz/brownfield.
Yeah.
You'll learn that there's a short link for everything in Azure Landing Zones. If you do ALZ slash whatever you think it should be, it probably exists.
Yeah.
We got like over 200 short links. So yeah, there's lots of them. But it helps you navigate our docs because there's so much of it. But that brownfield approach really talks around, okay, we don't want to come in and put like the controls in straight away and restrict those teams and stop them from operating what they've already got or stop them from innovating and delivering the value to the business. So we
Exactly.
talk around an approach of implementing the policies in an audit only mode, right? So the heart of Azure Landing Zones is really its management group structure, how we organize subscriptions within that management group hierarchy, and what Azure policies we assign on those management groups to enforce controls upon the subscriptions and resources within them. That's really the heart of Azure Landing Zones from a technical aspect. Now,
Yeah.
if you apply those policies and their default assignment value from Azure Landing Zones, they'll be in deny or deploy if not exists or modify, right? They'll
Exactly.
do things. In a brownfield scenario, you don't want to do that because you've got to be very brave to put them in that mode straight away. So we talk around in our brownfield guidance changing the enforcement mode onto something called do not enforce, which basically means it turns them all to audit or audit if not exist policies. So they don't do anything, but you can get a compliance status like red, amber, green.
Exactly.
How good are we? How bad are we? And then you can slowly iterate and start turning the controls on to have the proper enforcement effect. And then you can obviously add more controls. And I think that, it's not only the brownfield customers we need to talk around, it's how about when you're starting from fresh? Maybe you are a greenfield customer, right? You've got nothing and you're starting fresh today. Those application teams obviously want freedom. They don't want anything to do with a platform team. They want complete, no rules, no guardrails. They want to be able to deploy whatever they want, however they want, whenever they want.
Yeah.
The platform team obviously wants is, well, no, you can't have public endpoints exposed, or you've got to use customer managed keys, or you've got to enable diagnostic settings on all of these so that we can scan them and put them back into a log analytics workspace. Like all of those things. So how do you democratize? How do you carve those things up? Azure Landing Zones provides about 30 default policy assignments today. Some of them of individual policies. So most of them are of initiatives that control lots of things at scale. But
Yeah.
simple things like enabling Defender for Cloud on every subscription that's in the hierarchy by default. So you can give them a new subscription and you know that Defender for Cloud is going to be turned on and give them the recommendations and start firing off alerts when things aren't right. Things like making
Yeah.
sure that all the resources have their diagnostic settings enabled and sent back to a central workspace. Other policies like preventing public IP addresses being created in certain areas of the landing zone. So like the corp landing zone, as we would call
Cool.
it,
Yeah.
right? So like
Yeah.
we do very simple things like that help customers, think of it as the 80%. We're giving you 80% of what every customer should do. Then the 20% you now need to customize and you need to add on your own company's controls, your flavor, what color you want to make it, all of those things. And that's where you've got to slowly just implement the policies in maybe an audit effect first, see how it works, see if it's having the desired effect, and then slowly turn them up to the right level of control that you want at the end. And that's how you
Yeah.
don't annoy the application teams. Because one of the key things, and I don't know if you see this, Mark, but a lot of customers, platform teams go in with the sledgehammer and say, it must be like this. This is the way we have to do it. And all that causes the application teams to do is run away and do it somewhere where they're not controlled. And they do it on a credit
Sure.
card or they do it somewhere where it's not sanctioned. And you've
Yeah.
got shadow IT. So it's all about working together. A lot of
That's
platform engineering concepts come into this, right? Like the platform teams have got to think as the app teams as their customers of their product. So they need them to consume it, so they need to keep them happy.
You can say customers, but and that's how actually the Azure platform engineering concept describe it. But I also believe if you
Exactly.
look at dev and ops, that was more like two silos. We try to
Yeah,
combine computer storage network silos into something. We have those three teams to combine together, and we have some developers. We call it DevOps. And
yeah,
now with the platform engineering principles, it's like a next evolution of DevOps, where actually it's one team where you should, put all the strengths together and make it happen.
exactly.
Yeah. So if we look at implementation of Azure Landing Zone, so you mentioned the brownfield. Let's take a look at some greenfield because there we already mentioned there are accelerators available. Uh, what are they, and how can I implement them? Is that
Yeah, no, good question. So again, I apologize for the plethora of options we have here, right? There are lots of things out here, but I'll start from the portal, right? So we do realize there are some customers out there who are not ready or don't want to use infrastructure as code or scripting or any automation. Now, obviously, all of us in our perfect worlds would say you should use infrastructure as code and you should deploy it via CI/CD. But there are a certain set of customers that may just want to do something in a portal, get going, and then they'll worry about that later. And that's fine, right? Like we've got an option for you. So we have the Azure Landing Zone accelerator for the portal, where you can basically it's an ARM template behind the scenes with a really nice UX over the top that you fill out a load of options, and in about 5 minutes you fill out the forms, hit review and create, and in about an hour, depending on what networking options you enable, because some of the services take a little while to deploy, you'll have the big picture of ALZ deployed very quickly, right? So it's a very quick thing for customers to get going. A lot of people use it for dev test or a POC, like just to give them a quick picture of like, what does this thing do? How does it work? Like they'll use the portal to
exactly?
get going very quickly. But then on the other side, we've obviously got the correct side of the house, right? So you obviously have had Alex Frankel on from the Bicep world. Me and Alex
Exactly.
work very closely together on lots of things like Azure verified modules and Azure landing zones back in the day when we originally wrote it. So we have a set of Bicep modules that deploy the same architecture as what you see in the picture and what the portal deploys, but in Bicep modules. And with
Yeah.
that, we have an accelerator, which helps you set up GitHub, ADO, setting up the structure of that, setting up your pipeline, setting up service principles and secrets and all of that stuff. Because some customers struggle with setting up those things and they look to Microsoft as to be like, how should I set up my repo? How should I structure it? What should I do? How do I have a starter pipeline? So we've got all of that included in the accelerator. So you can either take the modules yourself and put them in your own workflows, or you can take our accelerator for the Bicep and it gives you everything, modules and pipelines, and sets it all up for you and does all the permissions. And then we have exactly the same for Terraform, right? So we have a Terraform module, the CAF Enterprise Scale module, because Azure Landing Zones used to be called Enterprise Scale back in the day. So if any of you see Enterprise Scale, that's where it came from. It was actually called Project North Star before that, right? That was its internal name. So it was Project North
Huh?
Star because everybody wants to go towards the North Star. So Enterprise Scale came, and then Azure Landing Zones. So yeah, the Terraform module is called CAF Enterprise Scale. However, we are just about, we're maybe a month away, 2 months away from releasing our second iteration of how we think Azure Landing Zone should be done with Terraform. And we've actually done a load of work. So my colleague Matt, who leads the Terraform effort in this world for Azure Landing Zones, has written a Terraform provider. So we're going away from having a module. We've actually written a provider for ALZ
Wow.
to do all of the complex data handling that the current CAF Enterprise Scale module does. If any of you have unpeeled the covers on the CAF Enterprise Scale module and gone, wow, that's complicated, we feel you. Like we also think it's complicated and we're now trying to make it easier. So we're moving a lot of the
Nice.
complexity into the provider, and then we're going to provide some new modules that are way simpler, and then also utilize the Azure Verified Modules project to deploy all of the resources like the hub networking, your firewall, your VPN gateways, all of those things. We're going to use AVM to stitch it all together. And again, we have an accelerator, and it's the same accelerator that you use for Bicep that can configure your CI/CD, but it also does state management. So it'll set up your storage account. It'll put private endpoints on it. It will create user managed identities on managed runners in Azure container instances that have permissions to talk to the storage account. So you really can bootstrap your GitHub or your ADO project alongside the declaration of the module for Terraform or Bicep in about, I don't know, 20 minutes. It's very quick. And it's just a PowerShell module that's hosted in the gallery that goes and pulls all of these assets in and stitches them together. And you answer some very basic prompt questions like, hey, I want to call it Mark as my prefix, and I want it in this region, and this is my address space. So all of that we've tried to make as easy as possible so that customers spend less time worrying about how they should build it and more time worrying about what control should we customize for our organization.
Wow, I'm really looking forward to that the update. So, and I should probably invite Metin as well in one of the future shows.
Yeah,
To explain
absolutely. Just on that
what you're
Terraform
doing.
piece, though, just on
Yeah,
that Terraform
exactly.
piece, it's really important. Like a lot of customers are going to ask, what are we doing with the existing CAF Enterprise Scale module? Like, what happens if I'm already on it? Importantly, we're not going to get rid of it just yet, right? In time, we do want you to move to the new one, but we're going to
Yep.
support the existing one for about a period of 2 years. So you still got time. We'll still keep all the policies updated and maintained and patched, but we will then start providing migration guidance and tooling to get you onto the new versions because that's where our future investments are going to go. So if you have the time and abilities, definitely move towards the new stuff when you feel it's ready. But we're going to keep the old one around for a little while because we obviously realize we can't just take it away and be like, ta-da, we're not supporting it anymore. Like that's not how we roll. So yeah, you've got about 2 years from when we announce it, which isn't yet.
Yeah. All right. So that's really good news. So I'm looking forward to that. If we look at the Azure Landing Zone structure, so the hierarchy you talked about, we have we mentioned already Corp Online. So those are the 80%, and then we have Platform, where that's actually where I feel myself the silo. If we look into old silo methodologies from companies where we have platform team, that is actually ops, maintaining the network, monitoring, security. And then we have the landing zones where the Corp Online. But I also see a lot of organizations that they don't want to fit it into the Corp Online. Is it also a best practice or a good method to say every application that I'm going to deploy is going to be a landing zone directly under the landing zone management group? So that means like app A is going on the LZ. So the ID is LZ app 1, and then the next application landing zone is app 2. It will be on the. Can you share a little bit on those best practices? How do you see it at your customers when you implement landing zones?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And this is a question that we got asked so much that we actually wrote some specific guidance just for this topic. So it's called tailoring the Azure Landing Zone. So if you go to aka.ms/alz/tailoring, see, I told you there's a link for everything, that you can find this guidance that you can read. And it's something that I actually authored about 2 years ago. But what we say is, you shouldn't create a management group for every workload beneath landing zones because really all we're using the management group hierarchy for within Azure Landing Zones is for policy assignment simplification, right? So we want to say that think of them as archetypes. So if you think of Corp and Online, they're two very distinct architecture style patterns or archetypes as we would call them. And that
Mm-hmm.
is Corp is private, no external access, and online is you're allowed public access. You're allowed public endpoints in Corp. In online. They're the only real differences from a policy application perspective between those two management groups. So there's no point if we had, say, you've got an organization that's got 10 applications and 8 of them are private, like shouldn't have any exposure to the public internet, and 2 of them should have public exposure to the internet. Why would you want to create 10 management groups beneath landing zones to represent all of those when actually the policy assignments that are going to be enforced upon them are all going to be the same across those management groups for 8 of them and the same for 2. So instead, you can collapse them into one and have one set of policies to manage that affect all of those subscriptions that live beneath that management group. And it's just an easier way of managing it at scale.
So may I add maybe a reason to do why to do it? Because actually that's what I do it a lot because see that with customers, when I provide my management group, it's not only the policy is inherited. So I agree with that statement that that's all the same. But what I usually do is we have app A, application A. We create a landing zone. And from the vending machine, we added a management group. We do the airbag on the management group with PIM assignments. Then we have test, acceptation, and prod subscriptions underneath, where we have an exemption on policy on test, on certain things that they want to play around with. And that's actually the base structure. And also, from an infrastructure code perspective, I also declare management group in code, and I can branch it off. So the app team can be fully responsible for the management group hierarchy, the PIM configuration, if they allow, based on the company where I am, they are allowed to tamper with it, or they are not. And then they have the subscriptions underneath with all the bicep deployments or other type deployments. And so that's the reason why actually, and that's why I want to ask, because do you say it's a hard no? I do feel when you have a management group and you have a management group called dev underneath, I fully agree with that statement that you should not do that because that's too deep. There's no sense to do it because again, you code archetype should be the same across all the subscriptions that you're deploying the application to. So there should be no differences between a dev and a prod environment. But from an airbag and PIM elevation perspective, and to maintain it all in code, and to be able to branch it off in a full hierarchy of your Azure environment, comprised or described in infrastructure as code. That's why I actually still do it and actually advise it to customers, right? And if you don't go too deep, so we have the tenant root, we have an ALZ or a name of the company, and then you have the ALZ, and so we're almost max four levels deep anyway.
So yeah, I think
Prove me wrong.
it's an interesting point. So there's actually, I think, a bullet point in the document that I write that says don't use the management group hierarchy for RBAC. Now that's not a hard rule, right? Like a lot of this, what you have to think about with a lot of our documentation that we write is written for the people that never get to speak to an expert like me or you, right? Or somebody who's done a lot of it. It's built for the self-service consumers who may never speak to a consultant or are doing it just from what they're reading. So we have to be very strong in our documentation and very opinionated on like, don't do this, do this, so that the majority of people do it the correct way. What you're doing does potentially make sense for some of the use cases that you're talking to. However, what we would then say is, I take it you're putting those management groups beneath a corp or an online so that you can still apply policies that are inherited down to them that they can't touch, because that's really the beauty of ALZ, right? The segregation between management groups are managed by the platform team and subscriptions are owned by the application team. Means you can put policies on the management group that the application team cannot touch or do anything about apart from have them inherited to them. So as long as you maintain that segregation, whether you might do it in a layer of management groups, like you might not give them access to Corp and Online, but you might have a child of Corp and Online for application A and application B and application C. That is a way of doing it as long as there's that segregation, because you can still apply policies above them that they get inherited to them that they can't touch. The only thing that I would say is creating a management group per application team. Yes, it simplifies RBAC if you've got two or three, like if you've got 50 subscriptions or 100 subscriptions per application. Yeah, it does make sense. And I've done it with some of those customers, like some of our large ISV customers. They have, one customer I worked with vended 20,000 subscriptions per application, per environment, right? Lots of subscriptions. That made sense to
Wow.
use management groups in the way you discussed, because it's serious scale, and repeating that RBAC assignment on all of those subscriptions would just take so long to do that it was
Yeah.
inefficient. But when you're talking less than 100 or 50, you're probably okay to do the RBAC assignment directly using groups and just doing it directly on the subscription and keeping that
Yep.
segregation boundary between management groups or platform, subscriptions or application teams. And therefore, there's never a mistake where somebody creates a custom role or grants a management group permission that they think that is fine and suddenly gives somebody too much permissions. Like there's that very clear segregation. So it's not a hard no to your question, but I would definitely advise that it's not
All right.
it's not suitable for every customer. Definitely got to understand what you're doing when you go to that mixed model.
Yep, yep, yep. Agree. Well, it gave me some insight as well, so I'm going to revisit that. Thank you for
No,
that,
no,
at
no.
least.
The beauty of it is keep it simple, right? Because the more
Yeah,
management
okay,
groups you
great. Yes.
create, the more duplicated assignments you've got to create. So I would probably say in your architecture, you probably are replicating a lot of policy assignments across each of those applications, or you might
No,
not be
no,
because you're doing it at the layer above, right? So
yeah,
that you're doing it the correct way. But what we commonly see people do is create the layer below, like you've done for applications, and then do policy assignments at each of those levels. And they've
yeah.
got
I've seen that as well.
90 policy assignments of the same policy across 90 management groups. And you're like, there is no point in that. Why? Why have you
Exactly.
done this? So yeah, you're using it in the correct way, but most people would follow that don't.
All right, thank you for that explanation. Appreciate it. So let's talk about a different type of landing zones implementation, because there is also a way. And actually, I think it's pretty new for multi-region, for example, the default deployment, sovereignty cloud implementation of Azure Landing Zones. Can you elaborate a little bit on it, on the different
Yeah,
scenarios?
yeah, absolutely. So Azure Landing Zones is like how do we call it? It's like the most generic, applicable to every industry, every style of customer, every shape, every size. So a lot of people ask me like, "Hey, we're a small customer, like maybe 100 employees. Do we need Azure Landing Zones?" And the answer is always yes. Doesn't matter
Yes.
how big or how small you are, you need it, because if you're small, you may grow. And me and you both know, as people who have been working with Azure long enough, that migrating things between subscriptions is not easy later on down the line. So you're better off starting scaled out, and it doesn't cost you anything to do that, right? Because you're only going to be charged for what you spend and what you use. So it doesn't matter across how many subscriptions you do that. Um, so Azure Landing Zones is like the generic, everybody can take this as the starting point. But then there are scenarios where things like the sovereign cloud or the sovereign landing zone, or cloud for sovereignty as it's under the banner, have come along and built on top of Azure Landing Zone. So if you look actually at the code base for cloud for sovereignty, you'll see that it's actually ALZ Bicep under the hood with some
Yep.
additional modules on top, just to make some very small changes for the sovereignty architecture. And that was by design. So myself and the Sovereign Landing Zones team have been working on that for many years now, like a couple of years. But we started right at the beginning of Azure Landing Zones meets pretty much everything we need. We just need to add some additional policy assignments and a couple of new management groups for confidential computing, because confidential computing is quite a big thing in sovereignty.
Right.
So it doesn't make sense to apply those policies to corp and online. So we created a confidential corp and a confidential online as siblings of those landing. So instead of there being corp and online beneath landing zones, you've got corp online, confidential online, and that just means we can apply some different policies that for confidential computing, right? That archetype mindset, keeping it minimal, just to those management groups, and then any subscriptions that need to meet those requirements go under there. Any that are more generic go under standard corporate online, and that's really the only difference. And some policies, right? So the Sovereign Landing Zones team maintain two initiatives today that maintain a load of sovereignty controls, like your data can never leave this region. Here, we'll help you put some policies in place to control that. And you may be thinking, well, that's really easy. It's just the allowed locations policy, right? But actually, when you start getting into it, like Cosmos doesn't control its locations in the same way. Neither does SQL, right? So there's other services that you need to think a little bit differently for. And that's where they have these initiatives that help you control those things. So they've built that on top of it. And we call them Azure Landing Zone variants. Now, when we were talking around the term variants, it was bad timing because COVID was very prevalent. So we were like, we probably can't use the term variant because it's got a bad rep at the moment. But we could never think of a better word. So now we're sort of out of COVID times, or it's not as bad as it was. Variants have come back. So we call them Azure Landing Zone variants because they are
Fair
Azure
enough.
Landing Zone at their heart, just with some very minor changes on top to keep them, make them more applicable to that industry. And there are more planned, right? Like there are different industries planned. There are more like verticals like people are looking into and trying to create. So watch out for them. There are a couple in the works that I know of that I can't speak of, but there's some that are coming. And then when
Nice.
you said things like multi-region, right? That's something that is foundational, right? So you can think of ALZ as the foundation layer, and then you've got these different like Lego blocks on top that help you get more specific for what you need. So multi-region is something every customer across every industry, every customer size should do. You shouldn't just have one region, you should have multiple. So we've put that into the Azure Landing Zones layer, and that means that Cloud for Sovereignty or whatever other ones appear later on benefit from that out of the box. So we maintain this foundation layer and then people build on top. So ALZ is the 80%. The ALZ variants, like Cloud for Sovereignty, are the 20%, or helping you get closer to 100% from our
Exactly.
80%.
All right. So if you look at then multi-region should be done by default. That's a quite high investment because two V1s, two V hubs, two firewalls, gateways. I mean that already adds up to a pretty nice bill.
It does. It does get expensive, right? And we've also recently defaulted all of the values for availability zones to be across all three availability zones for all the
Exactly.
services that support it. So Azure Firewall, VNet gateways, all of that stuff. We've also turned that up, which can increase the cost in some instances as well. What we've
Yeah.
taken the approach of, and this is the same for Azure verified modules that I know me and you are going to do another episode on. So like we'll hold fire for details on that. But
Yeah.
we've taken the approach of customers should be out of the box when they get something from Microsoft. It should be resilient, secure, and performant, right? Cost is obviously when you think of the five WAF pillars, cost is always the one that you can't have. You can't have all five. You have to make trade offs, and we've decided
Yeah.
that cost, whilst is important, and we don't want to charge our customers lots of money, the reliability and performance and resilience of their architecture is way more important than what the bill is at the end of it, right? You'd rather your application was up and running or your landing zone was operational versus it being down because you chose to take a cheaper option. You can certainly choose that. You can always turn it and change it in the options. All of our implementation options give you the option to lower the SKU or change it from three availability zones back to a single zone. Like all of that's your choice, but we recommend by default you shouldn't.
Well, it should be a switch, right? Like when there's the ALZ helper module, make it a switch. Enable low cost. And then
So
automatically,
we
when you scaffold the whole repo structure, that all the SKUs are actually already.
so it's an interesting point you raise. So we had the same thought, but we then thought if we had a parameter or a switch that said enable low cost mode, every customer would select it and they wouldn't understand what actually has happened or what the trade-offs would be. Yeah, but people don't read warnings, right? So like we
I
have to be
know.
really careful. So we've made it not difficult, but you have to consciously know and go what you're doing to change it back. So out of the box, it's going to be multi-region and multi-AZ by default. And that's just something we're doing as a big push for across Microsoft now is helping customers start right. Like how many storage accounts have we all deployed via the portal that have been open to the public internet access, no RBAC control? Like it's just not good practice. So we're starting across Microsoft to change that and improve our security posture, and that also relates to our customers. So yeah, it's a bit of a negative. It's also like DDoS. Everybody asks me like, why do you enforce DDoS on customers? And yeah, it's a big bill, right? It's $3,000 plus a month. It's a big bill.
Yeah,
But
it's
for
a
that
big one.
one moment when you've got an application that's being attacked and you need some more support and you need access to the DDoS team to help mitigate that, or tailor your traffic patterns based on its own machine learning model, you'll be thankful that we did it in the first place. So it's one of those. You obviously got the option to turn it off. Everything is optional in ALZ, but we set the
Yeah,
defaults to what we think they should be. You can obviously change them.
yeah. And actually, those are aligned with the Cloud Adoption Framework and the WAF Architect Framework. So it's
Exactly.
all everything is combined into a single best practice
Yeah, exactly.
resolution.
We want you to be able to take something out of the box and then not run a well architected assessment 3 months later and be like, why is that thing that we've just deployed from Microsoft not compliant with anything that's in well architected? So we're trying to make sure that they're all married up and they're all done. And like the well architected framework is something my team and people, my colleagues, are also responsible for. So we're also helping to drive those. So we all know what everybody's doing. So we're all trying to enforce everybody's best practices.
Nice. Well, really cool. So I think we covered a lot on the Azure Landing Zones. Do you want to share something that about Azure Landing Zones that I haven't asked, or some final notes? And also, we touched upon AVM. So if maybe we can have a little bit of sneak peek of what is coming into the next episode when we're going to speak about AVM. But first, the Azure Landing Zones. Key takeaways, or some things I forgot to ask.
Key takeaways are everybody needs it, and yes, you should do it. So go read the docs, aka.ms/ALZ, your starting place. Go and read it. There's lots to take in. I do apologize, but it doesn't take a lot to read the first few pages, and then you should get the concept of what we're trying to do. Some things that we didn't cover that are really important, I think, to think about is we have a community call. So the Azure Landing Zones team all lives in the open source world, right? We don't hide anything. It's not hidden behind paywalls or any of that stuff. It's all open source. So you can raise GitHub issues. You can raise GitHub discussions on any of the repos, and we'll respond to you within a couple of days generally. But we also run a community externally. So we run a community call every quarter. So once every 3 months. And we alternate that between different time zones. So some months it's on an EMEA and APAC friendly time, and sometimes it's on a US friendly time slot. I don't get the choice of which one I have to attend. I have to go to both. So it's either an early morning or a late evening for me. But we give that flexibility to all of our consumers because we appreciate everybody around the world is using ALZ. They're always recorded though, and they're always published on our YouTube channel. So you can go and check them out afterwards. And you can sign up. So the next one is on the 25th of September. So we're just starting to plan for that now. So if you want to attend the next Azure Landing Zones external community call, come along. We share lots of great insights about what we've been working on, and we always take questions from the field. So there's a GitHub issue that's there now that you can post your questions in right now, and we'll make sure we cover on that call. So even if you can't attend, we'll answer your question. But yeah, I think the one big thing about ALZ is we really love our customers' feedback. So if there's stuff that you completely disagree with what we're doing, or you don't understand why we've done it that way, or you think you've got a better solution, let us know. Like, we always want to know and always want to hear from our customers. And whether that's reaching out to us directly on LinkedIn, that's absolutely fine. Lots of people do that. That's how we got in touch, right, Mark? You reached out directly to me and I said, hey, yeah, that's a great idea. Let's do it. So we don't bite. Like, please do let us know. But GitHub issues is really the way that we would encourage most people to reach out. And then sneaking you into AVM. So we've talked about Azure Landing Zones, which helps you get ready, right? Like, helps you start. But what happens when you've done that, right, and your platform team have stood up this amazing Azure Landing Zones platform? You're now sitting on the other side as an application team going, I've got to build something now, but I don't really know how to build it to the best practices or securely or highly available, or highly resilient. And I can go and read all of these different Terraform docs or Bicep docs and build its infrastructure as code, but I might get something wrong. What we've done is we've built Azure Verified modules, building off of loads of great projects that have existed in the past that we've wrapped into this. So something called Carmel, you might have seen before, the Common Azure Resource Module Library. That's a lot of the heart of AVM, and we've now just finished that migration into AVM. But effectively, AVM is best practice, well-architected framework aligned modules for every resource in Azure in both Bicep and Terraform. We also have some pattern modules like the subscription vending modules that we use. They are AVM pattern modules because they do more than just a single resource. They do a whole architecture or part of an architecture, so bigger chunks. They're all tested. They're all supported by Microsoft. They're all backed by Microsoft. So, and they all have an FTE, so somebody who works inside of Microsoft as their owner. So, like, that they're built to basically get the application teams accelerated. Now, there is a gap in the middle about how does the app team set up their repo and their GitHub and their ADO, which we are addressing, and we can talk about that more on the next time.
Awesome. Cool. Again, really thank you for your time, Jack, and all the information that you shared with us about Azure Landing Zones and the sneak peek into the next episode about Azure Verified Modules. So that will be the next episode. Thank you for listening, and I hope to see you in our next episode.